these kind of changes taking place within the Adivasis or the tribes, the kind of gender and intergenerational dynamics, and the kind of intra-community and intra-community dynamics within the generations and the gender, and we have seen from these two case studies. So what I'll do, I'll open the floor for the comments and the question, so that we have discussion on this presentation for some time.
You spoke about generational as well as gender differences. So my question to you is, like, if I go to Jharkhand today, and how would I talk to a, like, say, a Oraon or a Munda youth, if I tell them that if he has to deal with the state, how would you theorize what is the way forward when you propose intergenerational differences? Like, say, like you're saying, the elder generation opposes the violent movement, but the younger generation, say, out of their frustration or of, say, an unfulfilled wish of their fathers, they want to pursue it. So how would you negotiate these terms, or how would you try to make him understand that? Like, how would he deal with the state and its mechanisms?
How would who deal with the state? The youth.
Yeah, that's me.
No.
Maybe we can pick up one or two.
Sure.
Okay.
Questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, Alex.
Yeah.
My question is that through your presentation, the non-violent and the violent was coming up. I think in the both movement. So maybe, putting movement into violent and non-violent binary, how do you come out of this traditional, the idea of putting it into non-violent and then non-violent, especially tribal movement. You also talked about movements in Africa, Latin America, where we also witnessed bloody, violent movement. So,
Yeah. Should I respond?
Yeah,
or
why
you-
not?
yeah?
Please, please.
Okay, I'd like to start with actually the second question. I think it's a very good question. I actually don't think that there is a very neat binary. But in fact, one of the things I want to show is that, how within actually one particular village also, you can find people who are at one particular point of time pursuing these different strategies. But the strategies themselves are not opposed to each other. And one of the things I want to talk about is also the complementarity, which often we don't talk about. And it's nothing as to say, we cannot say that people who are now in positions of authority as headmen or as village elders who are able to make decisions in the community, that maybe as youth they pursued very different forms of politics, right? And there is nothing to prevent people today who are, say, involved in the Maoist movement or who were involved in the Maoist movement to go and, say, work in NGOs, or to go and participate in a peaceful movement against land acquisition by Mittal or somebody. There is no hard and fast line that prevents you from it. But what I want to say is that, that in this particular case, I have tried to kind of make it neater than it is, because I want to kind of highlight both the complementarity as well as these differences. But you're absolutely right that, in theory and in any context, the violent and non-violent movements or protests are not opposed to each other, and they are entirely complementary. And I think, I don't want to tell the youth what they should be doing. I mean, I want to hear what they want to. So I think that if you go to any village in this particular context, or in most, or if you go to Chhattisgarh or Odisha, you will see that you just talk to people about how they associate with the state, and how, or even NGOs, for example, and you will see very divergent attitudes. And you will also, it's not just about attitudes in terms of the interviews. The actual interactions with these entities are also very different. So you can just observe how people are engaging, how they are getting, what is the relationship to NREJ. You can study particular issues or in the workings of an NGO, and who is also working in the NGO. Now, these are all things which affect the political subjectivities. And they also kind of, these are all options, I would say, that for youth politics is very different. And in fact, it's the convergence of these different actors where you actually, the youth politics emerges. And it also, that is one reason why there is a kind of divergence with what they would have grown up with. And it may or may not, turn into a kind of open kind of rebellion against the leaders, but the resentments will still remain. And even if you talk to people, I work on migrant workers now, as I was just telling, you will see if you talk to women, for example, who are working as maids, they can tell you their own stories of what is it like to live here and what is it like to live in the village within their father's home. And so these kinds of issues, whether it is of generation or gender, it's not very hard to talk about these things. This is very much out in the open.
I'm Gurkha, I'm a student of Masters in Social Work when I was at the study. So it was interesting to hear you about, hear you talk about this interface between society and state. And I want to bring in the question of identity over here because myself in social movements, I have found that most of these social movements were led by non-tribes essentially. And
not Koel Karo.
Not Koel Karo, but even because look at most of the I speak from my Chhattisgarh perspective.
Right.
So I've seen Bhumika movement of 1910 and then the recent Sarvadhara movement. So they were basically led by people who were basically non-tribes, and then they kind of brought in their own perspective of society and how to deal with state. When you talk about the reaction which comes from tribes, basically as primitive savages who can take bows and arrows and fight the state, and also as someone who can play the victim card, as someone who has been someone's rights are being slashed away.
Right.
So I find this dichotomy because when you say that there is this negotiation, constant negotiation happening, so the negotiators are somewhere not tribes, and then it's something which you are playing into. And as you see the change in identity when we're talking about young people who are kind of asserting themselves, they are basically talking about this separate identity where you are no longer a tribe and you become more of an urbanized mainstream person who's trying to grapple with the caste identity or class identity. Then how do you need Koel Karo as distinct from others?
It depends on what the identity is. I mean, people who are Munda, they are Munda wherever they go. I mean, people who are Bengali wherever they go. I mean, why is it I don't know why it is a problem. I mean, why would you become, maybe you will, I mean, it's not necessarily the case that if I am in the village, I will think of myself as tribe in the way that colonial officers have described me. So, or the anthropologists are describing me. So, I'm not sure, why, the question of identity also we have to think about it in a particular way. So, instead of, we often think about it in a very fixed way that, if you step outside that, scheduled area, then you will lose it. I mean,
the definition of tribe is something which is very kind of bound around a community, around a shared sense of culture, shared sense of
but that's colonial anthropology.
Yeah,
that's colonial anthropology, which is in fact what people, I think that as scholars, I think there is a very important responsibility to think through those categories. Just like people in the villages are thinking whether those categories fit them or not, and whether they can use them strategically for certain purposes. But the people who are migrating, there are people all over the world who are from these communities. I met somebody in Europe who comes from this Oraon community, and he was talking to me about his journey. And frankly, the senior most Catholic official in India is from Jharkhand. Philosopher Pope, and he was nearly Pope. So, he's a cardinal. So, I mean, I think that people's identities are many, and by traveling, it will not change. So, I don't think that will happen. So, people can retain as many identities as they want, And but in the case of one thing I think you mentioned was about this Salva Judum, and I think this is one of the kind of the dark side of negotiations between the state and the community, because actually the person who is supposed to have started this movement, or it's a movement or what, it's not clear, was a man named Mahendra Karma. Mahendra Karma was, he joined the Congress, though he was organizing this kind of activity under a BJP government. And of course he was also shot recently, as you may know. So now one has to realize that again it is a question of the internal politics of that particular place and how people get sucked into negotiations with the state, and how by trying to do something on the part of somebody who's acting as a patron for you, you may end up actually turning against your own community. Because effectively by trying to recruit people for counter-insurgency effectively, then you are automatically kind of widening a particular social conflict or a kind of gap that exists, and you are trying to militarize it. And effectively state is actually going ahead and arming people and saying you shoot people who you have a problem with. So, that is like, when you militarize an existing social conflict, then, it's the dark side, as I said, of these kind of interactions with the state. So I feel that, but it's not actually happening outside. There is a way in which the outside and the inside are kind of very closely connected. And Mahendra Karma was not an outsider.
Because Mahendra Karma is the face of the movement. The actual leaders who were controlling them.
Yeah, but
I know the three of those guys, and none of them are right from
Sure. But that is true of, that is true. But Mahendra Karma definitely is a very visible face. I mean, he is not a pawn in I would say.
His name got associated because of the 1991 Jan Jagran Abhiyan, which was a very short.
Yeah, he had an earlier career also as an activist in that area. You're right, absolutely. But it is because he was already involved in the local politics of the area, which is why he was co-opted for the purpose that he was. There's no doubt about it.
I'm Suman from Delta. My question is, there is a generation gap between the way the older generation is engaging in state and the newer generation. Now, my question is there a gap between the same generation, say the son of the headman or the daughter of the headman, how he or she is engaging with the development question, and how the larger frustrated youth engaging with the question of development?
This is a very important question. I have to answer the question from my experience as a practitioner in these areas rather than actually doing research. When I was there, I would routinely go and visit the Munda and other kind of people who had plenty of land. That was the kind of official kind of standard operating procedures. In most cases, the sons in this particular case were not doing very much. They had other people working on their farm, so but they had education. They were educated in some missionary school or government school nearby. So invariably, these people who had a lot of free time on their hands could be brought into the NGO work. But this was a process that created a lot of tensions within the household, because once they were basically, even though it's not like a franchise where you're wearing a t-shirt and saying that you're a particular brand, but once you do that, then the development generates its own conflicts. This is different from the conflicts that people have with the Munda's traditional office. So who gets the benefits of development, who doesn't, who is getting NLEGA money, who is getting SGSY money, which households are included, excluded, these all generate conflicts. Now, if it was done in a traditional way, then only the better of households with the most amount of lands would benefit, because it's their lands that need improvement, it's their lands that have to be leveled, the trees are also on their land, everything has to be done on there. But the moment the NGO is trying to make an intervention where you divide the communities, let's say we used to do it in this kind of wealth ranking or asset ranking, where you have A, B and C, you divide it into three fold. Now you let's say that you are specifically targeting the B and C, the two lower levels. Now automatically this is a cause of conflict within the community. And when the Munda's son is doing this, the actual work of implementation, you can actually see that this is a very contentious process. So development is not a very apolitical thing in this context. So even though NGOs, we think of this kind of work as a very technical and very narrowly focused thing, but it does, of course, this generational gap interacts with class issues, with other kinds of issues, to create sometimes explosive situations also. That NGOs are doing, and the mobilization that they were doing at night time, where they were speaking to the same, that B and C category within the community. So there was, so in their mind there was a complementarity, which is why I was not prevented ever from working.
Yeah. I'm Alex, Central Social Work, Social Worker. Actually, very impressed by the field work that you have done. And this is one thing that I've been also working and trying to understand, trying to provide the logic and try to feel it. Basically, one is talking about negotiation, and we have used the word intimate antagonism. It looks like terms in different kind of dialogues, but anyway, the kind of theoretical framework that's coming from here.
Yeah.
Is my understanding what I say, or what I'm thinking is, the reality is so complex. As you have rightly challenged the so-called, sensationalism, instrumentalism. Reality is so difficult to understand when you try to look at from the brain. And I definitely see this as a problem that's coming. So I don't have what is the theoretical position that I can take on. But I being myself in this process,
yes.
I know that suddenly there is a change process going on. And in this change process, there are many things happening. And basically these things of this like binary type of thing that's happening. And very, very clearly, very strongly, I feel in our context at the border, the changes takes place at this kind of two dichotomy, where on one side you have the individual, one side you have the social. One side you have splitting of the ecology, the economy, and the territory, and on one side you want to speak for ecology, environment. This is one thing that I know. And at the same time, as you look at it very correctly, the internal side of the intergenerational, and now we're talking about feminism within the tribe itself. Now I'm studying the chieftaincy system in the context of Manipur. You're saying about Northeast, and post-colonialism has not come, but actually in both ways they are there. It is very strongly there.
Yes.
Now what I'm looking at, now we have the Village Authority Act which is coming. Now these are modern government institutions, democratic processes that's coming inside. There is a strong resistance from the chieftaincy. Why? At the end of the day, I'm looking what is the main contention in between this kind of contradiction. At the end of the day, it's talking about equality and the life. One is resisting life and survival based on the whole connectivity between the ecology, economy, and people itself. And I have not gone to Coel Paro Dam movement, but in my reading of some of this write-up is coming. The success of Coel Paro Dam actually, in my opinion, of my reading of that, is basically comes from that a movement wherein the holistic type of comes against the forces that comes on a binary type of principle. So this is one thing that I constantly look at. For instance, like in Manipur, in specific. On one side, the chieftaincy, people fall on to chieftaincy because if the new governance processes comes, then at the end of the day, what will be what we call problem is the land. The land would be in the problem because there is oil, there is, we are in the strategic point to Burma and all that thing is there. So immediately what will be in sacrifice, what will be in question, in problem is the land. Now if the land goes, definitely the people also will go. That is the struggle that is coming through. So people will try to still hold on to this kind of chieftaincy, where you will call this an essentialist, or you can call it a colonialist approach. But the thing is that what is the political strategy that they have? It is the politics that you have to play. One has to play. The thing that is in sacrifice is the life. What politics that you play? It's a very difficult task actually in that sense. I have no opinion, but my confusion and my analysis around
Yes, yes.
it. I like your the way how you feel and that comes. That's
Thank you.
Okay. Two hands here.
Who wants to go?
Okay. Yeah, Prabhakar, you want to go ahead?
The thing that I wish to, I'm Prabhakar.
Yes.
The thing that I wish to, sorry. The thing that I wish to ask you is, you said two examples. One, primarily about the resistances that came to fruitful at the end, and the other one is the intergenerational differences that exist. Do you think that the knowledge, primarily the thing that I wish to ask you is how the knowledge is infiltrated in terms of what is good and what is bad for the community, and the new knowledge system that the young generations are getting into, and the kind of the dichotomy that they face in terms of with the elderlies. So do you think that the present state has played its role in terms of putting forward its strategically its own agenda? Sorry.
I said I had exactly the same.
The strategically, the step that it wished to envisage. So what is the kind of argument that you could find out of these two examples?
And if I can add to that,
Yeah.
when you're talking about divergent views of Adivasis, generational gap you are talking about, and you're talking about political subjects reworking the law, the question which is very, very important here is that education, the role of education and the state which is, as in the education that the Adivasis are getting these days, don't you think that is actually weakening their traditional traditional knowledge system? It is also weakening the fight, and that's the reason why they are not negating, or their fight is not as violent, and they are now negotiating with the state.
It can be violent.
And that's the reason. And that's the reason why probably they are also the education has actually the modern education has actually enabled them to question the traditional authority and their traditional way of operating, which is actually supporting the state.
That's a very interesting question. But you must realize that education is not just happening. This is not the first generation. You must realize that even the village elders are educated. And they are educated perhaps in the same village school that has existed, and it's not necessarily a government school also. So it's hard to say, because it's in some sense there were intergenerational conflicts even in the time of Birsa Munda, which you can see that in fact the FIRs against Birsa Munda were filed by the village elders. So question I was also, who has filed the FIR? That was the big question I had in the archive, and immediately I wanted to see. So one reason is, and he was also, the reason why they filed is because his followers had burnt the houses of, there was cases of arson, basically that was the accusation. So I feel that maybe it's not education, but the process of modernization produces these conflicts, and they produce the conflicts in every community all over the world, and I think people, young of course people are attracted to it, but as we find today in India, it's not true that the young necessarily identify with modernity or with progress. The young can very easily identify with conservatism also, right? So, I think that, we should, but yes, it is true that modernity produces its own kinds of social conflicts, and it raises questions of identity, but I think they cut across generation and gender in that particular sense. So how the alignments will work within the intra-community differences is, I think, an open question. It's an empirical question, because it could be said that those who are identifying as Hindu are facing the same problem, and frankly it seems to me that they are kind of moving towards more reactionary options.
Chakma there. Chakma, yes.
Okay, my name is Shamal.
Yeah.
So my question is that, are you negating the negation by saying that negation is externally viewed and by the externals and internally rejected?
Yeah.
That is the first question. And second is that in your whole negotiation, not negation. So how will you, what is the sustainability of construction to the exertion of, in the terms of tribes, not in the terms of external factors? Well, I mean, I am asking the question of sustainability over here.
The sustainability of negotiation.
Not the sustainability of negotiation in the construction of assertive in the terms of tribes.
See, I think the reason why, the question to ask, I think, is what is the option to negotiation? What is the alternative? The alternative some people have suggested is that you are invested in what we call tradition. Now, people may want to go and there is, they might be invested in traditional religion, for example. But at the same time, even the elders, remember, or whether it's the elders or the youth, they are not, both are negotiating. So there is, in some sense, the question arises for me is that as a state subject, and in a context where your interactions with, whether your livelihood, your marriage, your everything else is very closely, there is some kind of interaction with the governmental realm. So at that point, is it possible? Is there a kind of outside that you can lay claim to? That's the question for me. And what would that outside look like? I mean, even if I am trying to just do puja part, at the same time, I have some interaction because the person who is, for example, the official person who is in the village priest, the Pahan, who is supposed to do it, for example, in my context, I mean, he is a very important person. He owns a lot of land, he has certain traditional privileges of office and so on. So he is certainly not outside these inter-community dynamics. So for example, when that one young man is kind of questioning certain kinds of sacrifices of chicken or certain kinds of ritual activities, you can see that, religion is certainly not outside of these negotiations. So, in that sense, I really want to question whether there is an outside at all. Because one of the problems that we find, and this is true when in post-colonial and subaltern studies kind of work, we find that there is a very, there's a great temptation to claim an outside. And that outside is claimed both by the person we are writing about, or people we are writing about, and the writer himself or herself. So, but how can, I mean, it's not, and frankly, and all these people, they then invoke Foucault. And it's quite, I mean, it's not clear to me how, if you can read Foucault and say there is an outside for any person living in modern times.
Joy?
My name is Joy. State has reached everywhere. It has reached every nook and corner.
Yes.
In this context, how powerful or how binding is the traditional leadership? And if Adivasi women or girls are migrating to metropolitan cities to as domestic servants, is it because there is so much pressure on the women, or they're not where the traditional system is very patriarchal, or there are other pressing needs really in terms of there are economic crises which are happening in these Adivasi areas. Is it because of that they have to run away from their home for work? Another question is how about traditional governing system. Is it as a modern youth, as a modern Adivasi youth, is it negating? Is it all negating whatever is traditional, or it is also even traditional leadership also negotiating with youth? Means both youth and old people are in negotiating with one another. Because in this context we find that what constitutional privileges which scheduled tribe are supposed to get through traditional governing system, there is a recognition of it. And in order to get that, again and again there is also a process where there is a need to prove that there is a traditional governing system, there is a Pahan. However, whatever, whether it is powerful or whether it is not powerful, that is secondary. But in order to get something from the state, in order to get something from the state, there is again and again there is a process which has to reiterate that we have a traditional governing system. So, and I would also like, will you please tell how the dynamics in terms of religion is working in these areas, very especially in terms of Christians and Sarnas. What are the kind of responses you have got?
Right. Okay, so let me start with the first one about the women. And I think most migration is, we often tend to assume that it is purely economic, but I think there are a lot of non-economic reasons. Because if you look at it purely as in terms of economic rationality, it's not a very good decision actually, in terms of the possibility of saving, for example, and of kind of generating some kind of surplus from village work, from urban work, and also you think about the risks involved of migration, of even finding employment. Question of what are the kinds of working conditions that you have. If you just think about it in economic terms, it may be better to actually have an existing home and farm and so on, where you are able to just actually the costs are much less of staying home. The costs of living are higher. So this is something that we find again and again when you ask people why they migrate. And it's not just women; it's men too. They will invariably point to the urban experience as an attractive experience. So the urban has a particular kind of attraction, and even despite very adverse work conditions. So in some ways, the non-economic is emphasized above all by people themselves. Now, of course, it is true that this is mostly circular migration. It's not so there is a kind of way in which people are even in one particular year they are living in both rural and urban spaces. So it is a particular kind of there are particular choices which people make within their constraints of economics and the kind of economic situation that they are in. So, but I would like to see both the economic and the non-economic kind of emphasized in these choices. Because it's not purely a kind of choice driven out of compulsion. That's one thing I would say. Second thing you have talked about is these traditional systems of authority and governance and so on. See, I mean, first of all, these traditional systems have any meaning because they have been codified into law from late 19th century onwards. So it is true for the communities like the Garos as well, and there is a hill council, for example, or there is Mundas have their own kind of Padha council, and it's I think the issue here would be that when you have, for example, something like PESA also coming in, the Panchayati Raj institutions coming in, or you have Maoist kind of mobilization happening, you are invariably going to have a conflict with these pre-existing forms of authority and the pre-existing forms of assembly, association, because the leadership in these cases will not overlap. This is true even for NGO interventions. In the NGO intervention also is not always to the liking of the traditional leaders in the village, because they may destabilize. Some people may get more land, some people, and if not more land, some people who are seen as having the worst lands because they are right at the bottom of the structure may actually experience rapid increase in productivity of their lands, and this may cause a lot of problems. So I think that there is all of these things are kind of unsettling as far as traditional hierarchies are concerned. And what I would say is that now, in this particular context, one of the things I wanted to emphasize was that the Maoist entry into the area has caused its own forms of instability or their destabilization, and they have reified the existing social conflicts, militarized them, and now after that you had counterinsurgency. So many of the youth who are involved in the Maoist groups for one form or another, many of them, either directly or indirectly through their relatives, they also participated in the new institutions that PESA came into the area in 2010, for example. and it was part of the counterinsurgency package of Green Hunt and so on. So what happened is that the moment you are able to fight panchayat elections, Delhi is pouring in money from there, then what is the authority of the local village munda then? The decision making is happening in the panchayati institution. The new leadership is elected. Why would you vote for the munda and the people he is putting up in the election? So you see that there is a way in which even the relations with the state are going to change, and a lot of it has to do with how this particular conflict has panned out in the areas. That existing differences which are there in the community have been exaggerated and they have become the basis of conflict and also of changing political authority. And that's a peculiar situation. I'm not sure if similar issues have happened in Manipur or Nagaland in that sense, but I think militarization of conflict or of intra-community conflict is a very interesting and peculiar dynamic. And it's not the same thing as, say if this was 10 years ago. We would have seen the same differences, we would have seen even some people grumbling and having resentments. But it's very different when people take up arms and they try to create an alternative political authority. About? Religion. Religion. Do you have about Christians versus non-Christians? So I think there is a, this is a big issue now, because as we saw that BJP won all the seats in Jharkhand in the Lok Sabha, and they have formed the single party government in the state in Jharkhand. So it's given that Jharkhand has had 10 chief ministers until now, since 2010, it's not clear what is going to happen. I mean, it's not clear whether, for a number of reasons, is that one is that the way the state has been created, again by the BJP, which created this and all the Chhattisgarh and Uttarakhand. The state has been created in a way that was very different from the movement, the Jharkhand movement's demand. So, bordering districts of West Bengal and Chhattisgarh have been left out. The effect of this is that in the last two censuses, we have about 25-26% are classified as ST, which would be very different if the neighboring districts were included. Now, this is what is now called Greater Jharkhand demand or whatever. But the way BJP has created the state, Adivasis are in an overwhelming minority. They are 1/4 roughly. And now, of course, they have made it even more blatant by having a non-Adivasi chief minister. So they are clearly saying it is not a Adivasi state. So now in that particular context, now the question of religion, when you think about it. So what is the religion of the people in that particular say? Now are the remaining 75% going to identify as Hindu? Now what about the Adivasi community, which is itself divided, as you said, between Sarna and Christians, right? And some people are also now identifying as Hindu, because there is obviously, like in Chhattisgarh, there is Vanvasi Kalyan type of activity that is going on. So you see that, in that context, I have to say that given that only that BJP has won only a half, suggests that there are people who have other ways of thinking about both politics and religion. So I don't think that, I mean, even those people who are in the census categorized, the 75% who would be categorized as Hindu. Of course, there is a small Muslim population in places like Ranchi as well. But by and large, not all of those people identify with the BJP also, like in the All India case. So it's but I think all sides are trying to extend their religious kind of appeal. So definitely the Hindutva is expanding. Definitely Sarna is a particular kind of formation that is also growing in the rural areas. But Sarna will find it very hard to compete with both the Christian missions as well as the Hindutva Vanvasi Kalyan kind of thing, because it does not have the kinds of resources to provide. So it's a very hard battle for it to fight. And also the question is that the census, the way it records people, their religion, right? So there is every possibility that this current government will remove the classification that, may go off. They will just say it is either Hindu, Christian, Muslim, tell us what it is. So I have no doubt that this is going to happen sooner than later.
Dr. Vamore, then Mr. Suresh.
Thanks, Uday. This was really enjoyed it because you brought in the tribal king. Who showed was a very strategic subject, right? Who used law in a very strategic way. And overall, to make it complex, you brought in the intergenerational tensions, right? You almost showed that Maoists are modernizers. Now, this is very interesting because for someone, for people like us, social scientists, we are just used to think in polarized ways. You are making our livelihood problem. You are putting us at risk. Right? What you are doing is you are saying that tribals are normal subjects. Now I have a problem with this. Though I may not have a problem with this, I want to pose this problem to you to get answers for myself.
Right.
Now, by doing tribal as a normal subject, I think you are posing, this is not in continuation with our previous talk, but I think you are posing a tribal lens on the tribal identity in society, a liberal lens.
Right, right.
Because your struggle is just about what is the tribal individual doing.
Right.
You are trying to identify that. You are being too good an anthropologist, but not political. So, by doing this, I think you are killing the possibilities of a tribal revolution. Or my abstract idea that a revolution is possible.
Right.
So I don't know what kind of anthropology and academics this is, because this is meaningless. I'm being provocative. So here is a liberal, okay, for whom identity also matters.
Yes.
How does this help me understand the society and bring in a revolutionary change?
Right, right.
Thank you.
No, so I actually think that it is very specific to the tribal subject, because frankly this argument, let us say, even within the Maoist context, could we say this, say, for particular, say, Musahars in Gaya and Jahanabad, who were also mobilized by MCC? And I think the answer is no. So there is a specificity of being Adivasi in this particular context. There is also a specificity of being in a scheduled area. So I think there are, so the place and the identity in this as tribal is very important. And also the choices and constraints that are available to you when I'm talking. So for example, this case of in the anti-dam movement. Now dams are coming up everywhere, this kind of temple of modern India stuff is happening everywhere. But the resources that you have, and they are not just cultural resources in a kind of abstract sense, they are actually resources which are legal ultimately. And you are able to talk back to the state. And that's a peculiarity of this area. Only about, not even 1/5 of Jharkhand is scheduled. So if it was in a non-scheduled area, you cannot have this movement, to be honest. And then also in the case of the youth politics, if you think about what is happening, at the end of the day, what has happened in the last 10-15 years that the Maoist movement has had a presence in this area. What has happened is that it has, I would say, completely overturned the structure of authority in the rural areas. Now, if you actually compare with, say, Bihar, where the Maoist leadership came from, they kind of came southwards. Frankly, I don't think it has left the same impact on Dalit politics in South Bihar. Because in fact many of the gains of the movement in the 80s and 90s have been reversed in many cases. And frankly, NGOs and Nitish Kumar government have actually reached out to the Dalit communities in a very different way. And we see that process undergoing now with, say, the current Chief Minister as well, with the Mahadalit category kind of coming up. So I think the situation in Jharkhand is, I would say, a very rapid social change, and in a way that has made youth politics centerfold in the whole situation. And now it is probably not in the way that either Maoists or the state or missionaries or NGOs would have wanted. But that change has happened, and now it is really not reversible. We cannot go back to the traditional setup where the Pahan and the Munda and so on determine the structure of rural life every day. Because there is now PESA, which wasn't there. There is now young people in charge who are making these political decisions of the community. Women are also in the panchayats, which is just like they are in the Maoist group. So the women are also migrating in a way in large numbers, which is a big change. And migrants, of course, change the internal dynamics of the community also in particular ways. So I think there are many kinds of changes which have been unleashed due to what you can think about as a kind of fortuitous kind of circumstance. So because it's not like people wanted Maoists to come in and do these things. It's the unintended consequence, right? So it's a kind of social revolution by accident, And frankly, all sorts of political possibilities exist. When you are a Maoist, whether you are a bureaucrat, whether you are a NGO official, a missionary, Hindutvavadi, all sorts of possibilities people are seeing now, And frankly, who would have known that all of this stuff? I mean, that people would have, that Hindutvavadis would also see the possibility that now, after all this has happened, let's just attract the youth. So even some of the changes.
Scope for everyone.
Scope for everyone. So it's all up for grabs. Now, I think that's a very radically different situation than existed even 10 years ago. And so I don't want, and even though now this has happened, we shouldn't assume that this is here to stay. It may change.
Maybe I just add maybe more of a comment first, because I can draw parallels. Despite you talking about the petrochemical, which is very much there, comparing Muslims with but I thought the general arguments you make of the way to study state society, because I have myself used Abrams, I used Mittal and all these scholars, to look at the dynamic relationship between state and country. Instead of these polarizing views, which do not make sense in the field in any way. I guess, and this approach could help us study all marginal groups. So there is some parallels which can be drawn across.
Yes, there can be. But I think one specificity is because there is and I have written about this separately, that the tribal is legally a very different kind of society. And this is because of scheduling, because of the particular way in which the law itself constructs tribal. And I think this creates certain peculiarities. And in terms of how state and society penetrate. So it is true that in general that is happening. But I think how this is happening and the kinds of choices that emerge for Adivasi subjects, those I think are peculiar. So it's in that particularity.
Yes, in the field.
Yes, in the field.
In terms of overall, maybe there is a risk of saying that state dominates society. That I think various minorities, minor groups won't work. That one can avoid.
Of course. I mean, for example, it is like, if you ask the question, what is the implication of this argument for, say, Muslim politics in India today? I mean, it's not immediately transposable.
Yes, exactly.
Because Muslims' relationships to the state is very different. And it's also fundamentally an urban politics we're talking about, which has its own dynamics, right? So I think, I don't want to generalize too much, that's for that reason.
Suresh, it's almost something related to what Surikant is talking, because I have a very strong feeling that at one level, your denial is the denial of the subaltern studies, question of resistance, and you are trying to theorize the Adivasis as a negotiator. The sense that, for example, you moved away from one position of theoretical position of resistance to the negotiation. And you theorize that what actually the Adivasis are doing is the negotiation. That is, I have some problem, but I agree, because I know that your case studies is much more complicated than what you are talking by using the word negotiation, definitely. But see, I think there are two. One is the problem is the thing is that somewhere what is missing in your thing is the very nature of the post-colonial state and even the neoliberal state, for example. For example, one level, where is the possibility of negotiation is. Where is that possibility? I think the possibility is also coming from the nature of the state, for instance. And if that is so, I think the way that the subaltern studies or the whole historians theorize, even the colonial state, I think we have to rethink about it. And that is one thing because, for instance, like what you mentioned, the Pownellis, the cunning of recognition, the cunning of in the context of Australia. And if you look at it, I think that you can find it almost the same in the case, even in the colonial period, where actually the colonial state is recognizing some of it. So one of the things is that I think that the question is not something that Adivasis now started to negotiate. I think it is a kind of a complex relation that is existing between the state and state.
Yes, absolutely. No, I completely agree. In fact, what I would say is not that we have moved from resistance to negotiation, but I think that we have to rethink the idea of subaltern resistance itself in terms of negotiation. Rather than, what you find in early subaltern studies is a notion that people are just keeping the state angry. That they have a pristine primitive community or peasant community or whatever it is, and they are trying to preserve. So essentially the model is a conservative model. It's just about conservation of existing जो status quo है उसको maintain करें. Whereas in fact you are right that we have to go back actually to the colonial archive, and part of my work is also historical but it's specific to the region, and we have to try to think whether what we are talking about today may help us rethink the past as well, because this state and this identity came from somewhere. It didn't come just in the last 10 years. So all identity, whether you're talking about Muslim politics or Dalit politics or Adivasi politics, whatever it is, we have to understand the historical origins and roots of these issues. So what is it about the nature of the state that allows this kind of negotiation to happen? And clearly there are contradictions in the nature of state making, which are making these kinds of politics possible. Because if in fact the colonial state was such an absolute authority that it completely authoritarian setup in which there was no negotiation possible, then where would you get all this customary law and all this recognized, So I think that in fact we are living out these historical legacies which we don't fully understand, and that is really, it has to be worked out for every particular context. But I think there is a more general question which I wanted to bring out with this idea of resistance as negotiation, as opposed to resistance in the negation opposition kind of way. And I don't know, is that a liberal politics or I mean it could be, but it need not be, I would say, because many people, it could also be in some sense a very Gramscian way of thinking about a war of position, but the war of position happens within the state, where so there might be different ways of that, but I think I'm kind of open-ended on that particular. There are people who clearly see it as a liberal thing, but there, I always want to think that that is not something I'm very hard and fast about.
Okay, last question we'll take.
People are wanting to go for a cup of tea now.
Yes.
I'll keep it brief. But this arises from the sentiment which sort of I experienced when listening to you, which is that if I can take as a term sort of encapsulates for me what seems to be what we can learn from your work is the term called intimate antagonisms. In the sense that when you are talking about when you are encapsulating your understanding of negotiation through this term called intimate antagonisms, is this coinage fortuitous, or does it arise from a certain understanding of the notion of subjectivity, which seemed to be reflected when you were talking about its constitutive nature?
Yes.
And if it was so, whom are you addressing?
So I think the answer is yes, of course, and I would say whom am I addressing in terms of
theoretical position?
I think what I am trying to address is, first and foremost, I think because I think there is a kind of urgency when we talk about Adivasi politics and some of the issues I've talked about. There is a kind of political urgency. So on the one level, you see the way I framed it is there is a kind of in the context of India today, there is, I think, a very important need to rethink the Adivasi question. And that is, I think, a major motivation for me politically. But also, I think there is a more philosophical or theoretical kind of issue which you are, I think, getting at, which is that, which is, I think, why I brought up subaltern studies and so on, is that are we doing justice to our reading of Foucault? Because I think that if we are to both think through what he is saying, and then we really have to rethink more thoroughly the relationship between power and resistance, which for various reasons we have been unwilling to do. we have been willing to just accept them as opposites. Whereas to me it's quite clear from reading of Foucault that that's not the case. Right? Because power generates its own resistance, and resistance is intertwined with it. So I feel that, and then the idea of subjectivity or subject making that emerges is, I think, something. So there is, I think, a theoretical stake in kind of working out the implications of Foucault in the Indian context. I think, Partha Chatterjee's is a currently unpublished article called Governmentality in the East. And, I feel that, so this is an open question, what is the meaning? But I think from what I understand, that he has assimilated this to his idea of political society, where he thinks that there is a kind of split at some point of time in modern India, where the origins of political society come. And, whereas, he's basically this is a kind of way of saying that what was said earlier by early subaltern studies for the colonial period is valid, but post-50s, the constitution and everything creates a particular kind of subaltern politics, which we assimilate to this category of political society. So this is a new governmentality which is limited to the post-colonial, whereas the earlier work of subaltern studies is relegated to the colonial. So Foucault, therefore, is somehow only, there's a kind of partial working through of his ideas, and there is, I think, but this is not just true of Partha Chatterjee, but more broadly, I think we only take Foucault so far in rethinking and in thinking the nature of subject. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Okay. So friends, it was very, very interesting presentation we had, and very, very exciting questions and comments. I think nothing is permanent except change, and the change is going on in the society and among the Adivasis and Tribals also. And I see that within the traditional chieftain system also certain amount of modernity is coming. I am supposed to be a prince because my father is the king Raja of my particular clan. Last holidays when I went home, when all of us were sitting in the family in the evening, my father told everybody, since I am the eldest child, so I am supposed to be the inheritor of my father. So he asked me I should give in writing that I cannot or I should not inherit the kingdom. So it was a big surprise to all of us in the family, my brothers, my wife, and my brother's wives. That suddenly, we had never discussed about that inheritance of this kingdom, my father's kingdom, and that I have to give it in writing that I cannot continue or cannot inherit his kingdom. So I look after listening this present lecture, I see that within that traditional institution itself, certain amount of modernity has already begun. And when we were traveling, my colleague Bodhi and all, looking at the context where these case studies have been taken, like in Jharkhand, if we travel from, say, Uraon Belt, Gundla, Bharno, Sisai, Bharno area, to, say, for example, Khunti area, the kind of negotiation it is going on, I think it is quite different. And then from Khunti, if we go to Santhal Pargana and Chaibasa area, different aspect of different kind of negotiation happening. And when we compare with Jharkhand to my colleague's place, Meghalaya, when I saw there, the way the traditional institution and the chieftain across gender, rather women have become very powerful. They're in fact there to sustain how these traditional institutions can continue, because that is the only way they can protect their land.
In fact, there was a case where, when I was working for this NGO, they brought in some groups, say self-help groups from Nagaland, and they were trying to tell how these customary institutions were integrated with development and how they were pro-development and so on. The first thing that people said in the village is that if those people are tribal, then we are not. that was the, because people did not realize that there's to such an extent customary institutions would be dominant in this kind of sector.
So negotiations are there everywhere, different spaces, whether it is personal space or public space. The negotiations are all over. We have to continue. Thank you very much.
Just 1 second. It is my pleasure to offer thanks to Dr. Uday Chandra as well as to Professor Jojo and all of you for having come and attended this excellent lecture. You might have heard some things which are very new. He actually said much more than what he actually said. There are a lot of things which we can discuss. But it has been a pleasure on behalf of the school as well as the center to have you with us here, as well as to foreground this very important discussion. So thank you all for coming and making this program such a big success. I think one of the things these guys in School of Development Studies should learn is that something like Adivasi is central to it. You can't just talk about urban renewal and stuff like that. Infrastructure. Okay, so people are important. So thank you, Uday. Thank you, Bridget, for coming, and thank you, everybody. Please join us for a cup of tea outside. Thank you.